I stood frozen, heart pounding, as the massive wrecking ball swung through the air, slamming into the walls of Maplewood Haven, the place my parents had spent their lives building. Debris flew everywhere. Glass shattered like the screams of the terrified elderly residents inside. Maplewood Haven, home to 10 senior residents, was being demolished by the Homeowners Association, HOA, without warning. They claimed it was due to zoning violations, but I knew the real truth. When I uncovered the corruption behind it all, I realized I had only one option: fight back. Would you believe that all it took was an old bulldozer and some quick-dry cement to teach them a lesson they'd never forget? "They're trying to kick us out again," Mom whispered, handing me a certified letter with the HOA's logo stamped across the front. My stomach dropped as I read the words: "Cease all business operations within 30 days or face legal action." This was the third time this year they'd threatened us, and each time it hit harder. I couldn't understand it. My parents weren't running some massive business. They were caring for the elderly, providing a safe and loving home for people who had nowhere else to go. Yet somehow, Mrs. Holloway and her cronies were determined to run us out of town. I glanced out the window at her house across the street, watching her trim the already perfect hedges. She was pretending to mind her own business, but I knew the truth. She had been spying on us for months, and now she had the HOA backing her every move. 5 years ago, my parents took the bold step of turning our family home in Willow Creek into Maplewood Haven, a small, intimate nursing home for seniors who didn't want to live in those cold, sterile facilities. Dad, a retired doctor, and Mom, a nurse for 30 years, poured their hearts and everything they had into making it a place where elderly people could feel safe and loved. But for Mrs. Holloway, it was a different story. She didn't care about the elderly. She cared about the value of her property and the image of the neighborhood. Every time she saw a car parked in front of our house or someone visiting one of our residents, she complained, and every complaint gave her the power to rally the HOA against us. I clenched the letter tightly in my hands. "They can't do this," I muttered. "We have permits. We've followed all the rules." Dad came in from the sunroom, where he'd been playing chess with Mr. Caldwell, one of our residents. He looked over my shoulder, sighed, and nodded. "I know, but it doesn't matter. Mrs. Holloway doesn't care about permits. She just wants us gone." I turned and watched as Brandon Holloway, Mrs. Holloway's son, pulled into the driveway in his shiny black Audi. He ran a massive elder care facility 2 towns over, charging triple what my parents did each month for care. Every month, he tried to buy our property. Every month, my parents refused. "I'll handle this," I promised, as I grabbed my phone. I may not have been a lawyer, but I had enough legal knowledge from my time working at Thompson & Hart to buy us some time. A legal battle with the HOA might be beyond me, but I could at least slow them down. The next morning, I didn't hesitate. I walked straight to Mrs. Holloway's house. Her garden gnomes seemed to glare at me as I approached her front door. She opened it, and without a word, her eyes narrowed as she looked me over. "Jennifer," she said coldly, not inviting me in. "What do you want?" "I wanted to talk about the letter," I said, trying to sound as friendly as possible. "There seems to be a misunderstanding. Our permits are in order." "It's not about permits anymore," she interrupted. "It's about property values. The board has decided that a commercial business doesn't belong in our neighborhood." "Commercial?" I shook my head, feeling the heat rise in my chest. "We're not a business. We're a home for people who need care." She ignored me, tapping her foot impatiently. "The board has decided. You can plead your case at the meeting on Thursday, but the decision is practically made." As I turned to leave, I noticed Brandon sitting in her living room, pretending to look at his phone. Our eyes met for a brief second before he quickly looked away. The fight had only just begun. That night, as I helped Mrs. Whitaker into bed, she clutched my hand tightly. At 92 years old, She had seen the Great Depression, World War II, and more hardship than I could imagine. But now fear filled her eyes. "Are they going to make us leave, dear?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No," I promised, gripping her hand. "I won't let them." But deep down, doubt gnawed at me. HOA rules were murky at best, and Mrs. Holloway played the game better than anyone. The Thursday board meeting was a complete joke. 7 people sat behind a long table, Mrs. Holloway at the center, her lips twisted in their usual disapproving scowl. I presented everything: our valid permits, signed testimonials from neighbors who supported us, even a letter from the mayor praising the work we did. None of it mattered. "We've already voted," Mrs. Holloway announced before I could even finish. "Maplewood Haven violates HOA regulations against businesses in residential areas. You have 30 days to vacate the premises." "They're not clients," I shot back. "They're residents. Some of them have lived in this neighborhood longer than you have." Mrs. Holloway didn't even flinch. "Regardless, we expect full compliance." And just like that, 10 elderly people were sentenced to homelessness. The harassment started that weekend. HOA inspectors suddenly became a daily sight. They fined us for ridiculous infractions: a hairline crack in the sidewalk, a bird feeder that was 2 inches too low, Mr. Reynolds' wheelchair ramp being an unapproved structural addition. Every day, another fine, another notice, another attempt to break us. I filed appeals, called the county office, even reached out to a local reporter who seemed interested, until she suddenly stopped returning my calls. Mrs. Holloway had connections. "Maybe we should just sell," Mom murmured one night, exhausted, after opening yet another fine, $500 for improper waste disposal, because Mr. Caldwell's oxygen tank delivery had left a cardboard box on the porch for an hour. "No," I said firmly, slamming my fist onto the table. "This is our home. Their home." I pointed toward the living room, where some of our residents sat watching Jeopardy together, laughing as they shouted out answers. I wasn't going to let Holloway destroy that. Then Brandon Holloway made his move. An offer letter arrived. His company would buy our house for 25% over market value, but we had 48 hours to accept. Mom and Dad looked tempted. Worn down by months of fighting, they were tired, beaten, and that's exactly what he wanted. "Give me one more chance," I begged. "One more shot to stop this." That night, I drove to the county records office. I spent hours digging through old property maps and legal documents, and then, buried beneath decades of records, I found it: the key to saving Maplewood Haven. A grandfather clause. The original subdivision plan from 1972, before the HOA even existed. And right there, in black and white, it confirmed that our property was zoned differently than the rest of the neighborhood, with special provisions for multifamily use. HOA regulations couldn't override that. Excited, I called Lauren, my best friend from college and now a lawyer. "This might actually work," she said after reviewing my findings. "It's a legally protected zoning clause. Their rules don't apply." I was ready to bring this bombshell to the next HOA meeting. But then, something happened that changed everything. Mom and Dad had to leave town for 2 weeks. A medical conference in Chicago, where Dad was presenting his research on elder care. "Go," I told them. "I can handle this." Mom hugged me tightly. "Don't do anything crazy while we're gone," she teased. "Never," I grinned. I had no idea that by the time they returned, our world would be completely destroyed. That night, I noticed unusual activity at the HOA office. Cars coming and going late into the night, lights on past midnight. Through binoculars, I saw Mrs. Holloway gesturing angrily, while Brandon sat beside her, nodding along. "Something's wrong," I told Lauren on the phone. "Document everything," she advised. "I'll stop by tomorrow." But tomorrow came with a sound that still haunts my nightmares. A low rumble, growing louder. I shot up in bed, heart hammering, as the grinding gears of heavy machinery echoed through our quiet street. I ran to the window, and that's when I saw it. A massive yellow wrecking ball swinging toward our home. The screech of metal against brick jolted me into action. I sprinted downstairs in my pajamas, nearly colliding with Mr. Reynolds, who was struggling to maneuver his wheelchair toward the noise. "What's happening?" he asked, fear cracking his normally steady voice. "Get everyone to the back door," I ordered, my pulse pounding. "Now!" Outside, the nightmare unfolded in slow motion. A towering demolition crane loomed over our front yard. The wrecking ball swung again, smashing through the living room wall, turning furniture into splinters. Mrs. Holloway stood behind a hastily erected safety barrier, clipboard in hand, her face as cold as stone. "Stop!" I screamed, running toward the operator. "There are people inside!" The man hesitated, his hand on the lever, looking at Mrs. Holloway for direction. She didn't even blink. She simply nodded. And the wrecking ball swung again. The wrecking ball slammed into the house again, shattering the front entrance into a cloud of dust and splinters. The deafening crash sent a shockwave through my chest as pieces of furniture, shattered glass, and personal belongings tumbled into the street like discarded trash. "Stop!" I screamed, my voice raw. "You can't do this!" But Mrs. Holloway stood there, completely unfazed, her grip tight around a stack of official-looking papers. "Section 8, Paragraph 4, she announced coldly. "No commercial enterprises in residential areas. The board has determined that Maplewood Haven is in violation of our covenant restrictions." Her words sounded rehearsed, robotic. She wasn't even looking at me, just watching the destruction unfold like it was some business transaction. "This isn't a business!" I shouted, stepping closer. "It's a home! We have legal permits! You can't just demolish an occupied building!" Another hit. The wrecking ball crashed through my parents' bedroom, sending photo frames, medical books, and years of memories raining down like confetti. Behind me, I heard Mrs. Whitaker start to sob. I spun around. The 10 elderly residents, some in wheelchairs, some barely able to stand, were huddled together in the driveway, still in their nightclothes, watching their home crumble before their eyes. Confused. Terrified. Helpless. "Those permits were invalidated yesterday." Mrs. Holloway finally turned to face me, her lips curling into the faintest smirk. "Emergency board decision. Unanimous." She held up a court order, waving it like a trophy. "We have court approval." I lunged for the paper, but 2 security guards stepped in front of me, blocking my path. "That's impossible!" I gasped. "We weren't notified of any hearing." Mrs. Holloway's smile didn't waver. "Notice was delivered," she said smoothly. "Perhaps you missed it." Another crash. This time, it was the kitchen. The wrecking ball obliterated the space where Dad used to grow mint for Mrs. Whitaker's tea. The smell of fresh herbs mixed with dust and destruction. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. "Emergency services, what's your emergency?" "They're demolishing our nursing home, with people still inside," I choked out, running back toward the residents. As I tried to lead them to safety, I caught sight of Brandon Holloway, watching from across the street. Sitting comfortably in his black Audi, his phone tilted just enough for me to see. He was recording his victory. The police arrived 12 minutes later. 12 minutes of pure hell. By then, half our home was reduced to rubble. I rushed toward Officer Daniels, pointing wildly at the destruction. "They're tearing down an occupied building. You have to stop this." He frowned, looking from me to Mrs. Holloway. "Ma'am?" he asked her, hesitant. She immediately stepped forward, cool and collected, handing over her stack of papers. "Everything is in order, officer. Court-approved emergency demolition due to structural concerns and zoning violations." I almost screamed. "That's a lie!" I shouted. "There were no structural issues, and we have zoning exemptions." Officer Daniels scanned the documents, his brow furrowing. Then he sighed. "These appear legitimate." "No," I shook my head violently. "Let me see them." Mrs. Holloway snapped the papers away before I could reach them. "Official court documents," she said. "I don't have to show them to you." "Actually," Officer Daniels hesitated, "if this is her property—" "It's HOA property now," Mrs. Holloway cut him off sharply. My knees nearly buckled. "What?" She smiled, a slow, deliberate smile. "Foreclosure for unpaid fines was completed yesterday. The property legally belongs to the HOA." My blood turned to ice. "That's impossible. We paid everything." "Not the special assessment," she said smoothly. 30,000 Oz, that's what they had fined us. In secret. They had pushed it through overnight, then declared us delinquent before we even knew what happened. Mrs. Holloway tilted her head, pretending to be sympathetic. "Notice was delivered by certified mail," she purred. "Not my fault if you didn't check your mailbox." I couldn't breathe. I turned back to our residents. Their medications, their belongings, everything they needed was still inside. And the wrecking ball kept swinging. I had never felt so helpless. The demolition continued while Officer Daniels made phone calls, trying to verify the orders. But it was too late. With every swing of the wrecking ball, another part of Maplewood Haven, another piece of my parents' life's work, was reduced to dust and debris. Mr. Reynolds' prized record collection? Gone. Mom's handmade quilts? Pulverized. Dad's medical library? Destroyed. A few minutes later, an ambulance arrived. Mrs. Whitaker was clutching her chest. Mr. Caldwell was panicking. His heart medication was still inside. I turned to one of the officers. "We need paramedics, now!" They nodded and radioed it in. I could feel my heart hammering so hard it hurt. Then my phone rang. It was Lauren. "Where are you?" she demanded. "Lauren, they're demolishing our home right now. The HOA is claiming foreclosure, zoning violations." "That's not possible," she cut me off. "I'm on my way." But by the time her silver sedan screeched to a halt in front of our property, it was over. The main structure had collapsed, leaving only the east wing, where most of the residents' rooms had been. Lauren stormed straight to Mrs. Holloway, her lawyer instincts fully activated. "Show me the court order, now!" Mrs. Holloway handed her the same stack of documents she had given Officer Daniels. Lauren's face darkened as she scanned them. Then she froze. "This isn't a demolition order." Hope flared in my chest. "What?" Lauren's voice was deadly calm. "This is a nuisance complaint. It hasn't even been heard by a judge yet." For the first time, Officer Daniels hesitated. "Wait, what?" he muttered. Lauren flipped through the papers, her hands shaking with anger. Then she found it. The smoking gun. "This is for the wrong address." She held up the document, shoving it toward Officer Daniels. "This demolition order is for 1625 Birchwood Avenue, not Birchwood Lane." For the first time, Mrs. Holloway's face betrayed something. Uncertainty. A clerical error. That's all it was. A clerical error had just destroyed my parents' life's work. And in that moment, as I stared at the pile of rubble that used to be our home, I made a decision. Mrs. Holloway thought she had won, but she had no idea what was coming next. Stood in the wreckage of Maplewood Haven, my hands clenched into fists. The dust in the air burned my throat, but I barely noticed. Around me, our elderly residents huddled in shock, some still crying, some too numb to react. Mrs. Whitaker was in the hospital. Mr. Caldwell had lost his medication, and my parents, who had no idea any of this had happened, were due back in a few days. And Mrs. Holloway? She walked away completely unfazed, handing me one final notice before leaving. "Have the debris cleared by Sunday, or you'll face additional fines for neighborhood eyesore violations." Then she got into Brandon's Audi, the two of them smirking as they drove off. That was the moment I stopped playing fair. That night, I met Lauren at her office, spreading every document we had across her desk. "I need to know what really happened," I said, my voice shaking with barely contained rage. Lauren nodded, already dialing contacts. "The HOA needs permits for demolition," she muttered. "Let's find out if they actually got them." She called City Hall, but the permit records weren't adding up, and the more we dug, the worse it got. The HOA meeting where they voted on the demolition? My parents were never notified. The zoning violation they cited? The rule was changed last month, with no official vote recorded. The board members who supposedly approved it. Two of them had resigned weeks ago. Everything reeked of fraud. Why would Holloway go this far? Lauren wondered, flipping through more records. The answer came at 3 a.m., when I found an old newspaper article buried in an online archive. There it was. A new luxury senior facility was opening in the next town. Owner, Brandon Holloway. Opening date, 3 months from now. My stomach twisted. "Oh my God," I whispered, staring at his smug face in the photo. They didn't just want us gone. They wanted our residents to have no choice but to go to his facility. Lauren's face darkened. "That's not just unethical. That's illegal." We needed proof. For the next 5 days, I barely slept. Lauren pulled legal records. I went door to door talking to former HOA board members, and we tracked every financial transaction we could find. Then, a breakthrough. Mr. Navarro, a former board member, agreed to talk. "I quit because things got shady," he admitted, looking around nervously before handing me a flash drive. "Holloway started making decisions without the board's approval. She forced people out. When I questioned her, I got pushed aside." That night, Lauren and I listened to the unedited HOA meeting recordings. Our faces grew darker with every minute. "We need to get rid of that nursing home before Brandon's facility opens," Mrs. Holloway's voice crackled through the speakers. "If we stall them long enough, the residents will have nowhere else to go." Then came the smoking gun. A security camera recording from Mrs. Callahan, one of our supporters. Her house faced the HOA office, and her cameras had caught something suspicious. Brandon handing his mother a thick envelope in the HOA parking lot. Then, she hugged him. "This isn't just HOA tyranny," Lauren whispered, staring at the footage. "This is bribery. We had enough to go to the police, but I wanted more. I wanted justice. And maybe I wanted revenge." The next day, I visited our displaced residents at the community center. They were sleeping in makeshift cots, sitting on plastic chairs looking lost and hopeless. Mrs. Callahan's mother clutched my arm. "When can we go home?" she asked weakly. I swallowed hard. "Soon," I lied. I wasn't going to let Holloway win. That night, I parked outside the HOA office, watching. I had spent days studying their security setup, the cameras, the alarm system, the blind spots. At 3 a.m., I made my move. Was I really about to do this? I thought about my parents coming home to nothing, our elderly residents scattered with no place to go, Brandon Holloway laughing in his car as our home was destroyed. My fingers tightened around the bulldozer keys. Because if there was one thing I had learned from them, sometimes you had to play dirty. The bulldozer keys felt heavy in my pocket, weighted down with rage, justice, and maybe just a little bit of madness. I had spent days watching the HOA office, mapping out every camera angle, every security blind spot, every escape route. If they thought they could demolish Maplewood Haven and walk away untouched, they had another thing coming. This wouldn't just be about destruction. This was about sending a message. Step 1. Cover my tracks. At 9:45 p.m., I walked into the Cedar Street gas station, bought a 6-pack of soda, and casually let the cashier see me. Security cameras? Check. Alibi? Established. Then I took a long, winding drive around town before parking in an abandoned construction site 2 blocks from the HOA office. The bulldozer I had bought at auction sat waiting under a tarp. I had tested it twice already. I knew exactly how to start it without triggering the beeping alarm. At 2:30 a.m., I slid into the driver's seat, heart pounding, and turned the key. The engine rumbled to life, deep and low. I took one last breath. Then I hit the gas. Step 2. The first strike. I took the back road, avoiding the main streets. The HOA office appeared in front of me, its smug little brick building sitting there like nothing had happened. Except something had happened. It had ripped apart my family's life. I gunned the engine. The first crash was deafening. Glass exploded outward as the bulldozer blade slammed through the front doors, sending papers, desks, and that stupid Neighborhood Excellence Award plaque flying across the parking lot. The alarms started wailing. I didn't stop. I reversed, adjusted my angle, and hit the support beams next. The walls shuddered, cracks racing up the bricks like lightning. I barely heard the sirens in the distance over the roar of the engine. Plenty of time. Step 3. Bury the evidence. I climbed out of the bulldozer and pulled 3 bags of quick, dry cement from the back. I worked fast, dumping water and mix, smoothing it across the wreckage. By the time I was done, the HOA office wasn't just destroyed. It was paved over. I grabbed the pre-made metal sign from my truck, jammed it into the fresh cement. Maplewood Haven visitor parking, reserved. I stepped back, admiring my work, just as the first police car screeched around the corner. Time to go. Step 4. Watch the fallout. At 6:30 a.m., I sat in my car across the street, sipping coffee as the news vans arrived. The reporters swarmed the scene, cameras rolling, capturing the wreckage of the HOA office, and the freshly paved parking lot where it used to stand. A live broadcast crackled through my phone. We're here in Willow Creek, where the HOA office has mysteriously been replaced. Officials arrived this morning to find the entire structure demolished and the land paved over. I couldn't help but smile. Then, right on cue, Mrs. Holloway's silver Lexus screeched to a halt. She got out wild-eyed, staring at the scene in horror. Moments later, Brandon arrived, jumping out of his Audi. "What the hell happened?" he yelled. The cameras flocked to them. I could almost hear their brains scrambling for excuses. Then, a police officer approached Mrs. Holloway. "Ma'am, we need to ask you some questions." About time. Step 5. The final blow. At 9:00 a.m., Lauren called. "Turn on Channel 7. I did. And there it was. Breaking news. Willow Creek HOA officials under investigation for corruption and fraud. It was all over the news. The secret bribes, the illegal fines, the shady deals with Brandon's facility. Lauren had anonymously leaked the evidence to the media and the DA's office at the same time. The DA had already launched an official investigation. Brandon and Mrs. Holloway were done. And the best part? The county records department had confirmed that the land under the HOA office was technically county-owned property, which meant, "They can't even rebuild the office," Lauren said, laughing. "It was illegally placed 6 feet over the property line. The county is reclaiming it." I stared at the screen in disbelief. We hadn't just destroyed the HOA. We had erased it from existence. Later that night, I stood outside the ruins of Maplewood Haven, staring at what was left. My parents finally arrived home. Mom's hand flew to her mouth as she took in the destruction. Dad just stood there, silent, his face hollow. "Where are the residents?" Mom whispered. "We found them temporary housing," I said, "but we're going to rebuild." Dad's eyes flickered toward me. "How?" I smiled. "The county is giving us emergency permits." Lauren had pulled some strings. With the HOA gone, All their ridiculous restrictions were null and void. A new Maplewood Haven was already in the works. And Brandon's luxury senior facility? The state was shutting it down after uncovering multiple cases of elder neglect. Karma had come for them both. A month later, I stood in the newly rebuilt Maplewood Haven, watching as Mrs. Callahan settled back into her old room. She smiled, patting my hand. "You're a good boy." I laughed. "You sure about that?" She winked. "Sometimes things need to be broken before they can be fixed properly." Through the window, I could see Brandon's old facility being converted into affordable senior housing. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of everything finally lift. Sometimes justice needed the legal system, and sometimes justice needed a bulldozer. I was sipping coffee on the front porch of Maplewood Haven when the news broke. Mrs. Holloway and Brandon had been arrested. Fraud, bribery, elder abuse. It was all over the local and national news. Every detail, the illegal demolition, the secret fines, the payoff in the parking lot, was exposed for the world to see. Brandon's fancy elder care facility? Shut down. The county was turning it into affordable senior housing. The best part? The HOA had officially dissolved. I turned off my phone and walked inside. 3 months later, the new and improved Maplewood Haven stood proudly where the old one had been. The county had fast-tracked every permit. The community had pitched in to help rebuild, and for the first time in years, our family wasn't living under the HOA's shadow. I watched as Mrs. Callahan unpacked her things in her freshly painted room. "You did good, kid," she said, patting my hand. "You sure about that?" I grinned. She winked. "Sometimes rules need to be broken to make things right." Through the window, I saw the empty lot where the HOA office used to stand. I smirked. Maybe I had bent the law a little. Maybe I had played dirty. But if there's one thing I learned, it's that some battles aren't won in courtrooms. Sometimes, to take down the people who hide behind rules, you need a bulldozer.